Hello, my name's Ed Hughes, and I'm the director of the Counseling Center, a drug and alcohol treatment program in Southern Ohio. What you're about to see is our sessions of the Loved Ones group that we have taped for your benefit. The Loved Ones group started a few years ago here at the Counseling Center, an effort on our part to try and get information about addiction, alcoholism to family members. What we discovered is that family members can have a dramatic impact on when someone gets well. If they are armed with the right kind of information, able to share that information in the right way and develop new strategies for being able to deal with the loved one that they're concerned about. In these sessions, you're going to see a discussion about addiction as a disease, how the disease progresses, how someone makes a decision to get better, how the family plays a part in that, and also what early recovery looks like. You're also going to see a discussion with some family members that have graciously agreed to come and share a part of their story. And then finally, you're going to hear a young woman share her story of recovery. Our hope is that you will be able to lay claim to the hope that we believe is available to family members, that they can have a dramatic impact upon their loved one, and to be able to see people that can come in and share in recovery. We believe this to be true for the family members that have come through our Loved Ones group, and we believe that it can happen to you as well. It is really part of our responsibility to be able to share this message of hope with you. And I hope that you enjoy the videos that you're about to see. Thank you. I'd like to welcome you all to a special session of the Loved Ones group. My name's Ed Hughes. We've been doing the Loved Ones group now for a few years, and what we have learned here in trying to provide information to family members who are concerned about someone's drinking or drug use is that it's not only helpful to the family member, but the ultimate help we're hoping to see happen is to the person who does have an addiction. And what we know is that family members can be the perfect channel of information and change as we try to help people who have drug and alcohol problems. And so as we start to explore family members' roles and how families and friends and co-workers all get kind of entangled in this web of addiction, then what we start to see is that there are certain things that we can do from an education standpoint, and then also in terms of developing some strategies in terms of how we might be able to more effectively deal with someone who has a drug or alcohol problem that again will ultimately be helpful to that person in terms of being able to get the help that they need in terms of treatment or some type of recovery service. So that is kind of the ultimate goal of the Loved Ones group, is to be able to be helpful to somebody who has an addiction. But in order to do that, many times families have to make some pretty significant changes in terms of how they are currently dealing with the problem of addiction. And that becomes a struggle for the family, because not only does addiction take hostage of the person who is using drugs or alcohol, but it also takes a hostage of the family. And again, it could be friends and co-workers as well in terms of the dramatic impact that it has. The way that we're going to do this is we're going to do this with several sessions, and what we're going to talk about first is the disease of addiction. And I'll keep using that word disease in order to try and also bring about a change in how we perceive alcoholism and other drug addictions, and being able to look at this as a disease. And we'll talk about how this disease progresses, how it affects the person with the disease, and how it also affects the family members and friends that are kind of being drug along or as sometimes said, on the roller coaster ride with that person. So that's what we'll focus on, and then we will also be able to talk about how does someone reach a point where they want to get help, and how can the family play a role in that. And then we will move on to talking about what does the family need to specifically do in order to help and develop a strategy that can be helpful to the person. And then finally we'll talk about what does it look like when someone is getting better? How does someone engage in a treatment process? Or what are 12-step recovery groups? And what does early recovery look like? And so that's kind of how we'll finish up in terms of the various sessions that we'll be talking about. But we're going to start off by talking about the disease of addiction. And again, I'll share my own story in terms of how that word came into my vocabulary. And again, it may be the same that as some of you have experienced. And that is, I've been hearing about the disease of alcoholism or disease of drug addiction for a long time. And probably 30 years ago, I was exposed to some information in terms of in school talking about that addiction is a disease. But I believe that my own personal definition of what addiction would be or alcoholism would be is that someone has some type of an emotional problem or environmental problem or some type of living problem that caused them to turn to drugs and alcohol as a way of dealing with that. That would have been my definition probably of addiction. And then as a result, I would think that we are now using this word disease because, well, it just sounds a little better, doesn't it? To say that someone has a disease versus someone drank themselves into this condition or used drugs that got them into this mess that they're in. But I probably would have seen the word disease meaning a way to kind of reduce the stigma that's associated with addiction. And if that helps, if reducing the stigma helps people get into recovery, then that's all the better. But I didn't understand the word disease as it related to alcoholism and drug addiction. And that's what became a beginning point for me, a very important beginning point for me to understand this. And we all come to this with our own definition of what addiction is. And we will see that that becomes very important. In other words, if my definition of what an alcoholic is someone that drinks every day, can't hold a job, lives in the park or under the bridge, then when might I be willing to look and consider myself to have a problem with alcohol? Only when I match that definition. Only when I reach that point would I be able to think, well, yes, perhaps, now I'm an alcoholic because I'm living in the park or under the bridge, I'm drinking every day. But what we're going to see is that the disease of addiction isn't really like that. That person who we have defined as being an alcoholic, the person who's living on Skid Row that can't hold a job, that's drinking every day, didn't always look like that. That wasn't how they started their drinking career. They didn't always look like that person. So we're going to challenge our definition of addiction. And it's kind of difficult because one of the things that family members struggle with is they have their own definition of what an addict or an alcoholic is. And again, that kind of prolongs the process of us being able to deal with this because until their loved one reaches that point of matching that definition, then they would perhaps call it something else. But if we're going to say this thing's a disease, then we need to know what it's about. What kind of a disease is it? Because a disease has something to do with the body, and that's where we want to start with this. Addiction is a chronic, progressive, physiological condition. It is a physiological disease, and it has some very profound emotional, psychological, social, family consequences. In fact, what we will see is that addiction affects everyone, not just the person that has the disease, but the co-workers and the friends and the family members and society in general become affected by this disease. But again, it starts off by we want to look at it in terms of disease and start to understand that this is a disease of the body, not psychology, not environment. And as we start to talk about this, I really welcome you to ask questions because this is kind of a new idea. It was a new idea for me. Again, the word disease might be comfortable, but what does that really mean? There are various pathways to addiction, and I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 of them as we move through this information here in this first session. And in other words, not everyone finds their way into addiction the same way. And we know that there are different drugs, and we're going to talk about some of the differences in those drugs in a general way. But I'm going to start off talking about alcohol, and then we'll kind of move over into discussion of some other drugs as well. And again, in order to understand alcoholism and understand the drug alcohol, first of all, we're talking about ethanol. Ethanol is the chemical that makes up whatever alcoholic drink a person is drinking. You ever heard anybody say, well, I couldn't be an alcoholic, I just drink beer. Yeah, that's very, very common. I just drink beer. I couldn't be an alcoholic. I just drink beer. Well, that's the same as saying I couldn't be an alcoholic. I just drink ethanol. Because ethanol is the same if it's beer, if it's wine, whiskey, gin, vodka, whatever it may be. It's all ethanol. And what we're going to look at first here is how ethanol is metabolized by the body, what happens when someone drinks. And I put 3 things up here on the board, and these notes up here on the board are mainly for me, so I can kind of keep track of where I'm going. But we know that alcohol, and again, if you remember if you were in high school and you had a health book, there was a chapter on drugs and alcohol and tobacco. You remember those? That chapter? And in that chapter on drugs, alcohol, and tobacco, there was always this one big page. It was usually 2 pages in the book. And on this side, it had all the different drugs listed, and then it had different characteristics of those drugs and the type of drug that they were. And if you looked across at alcohol, alcohol was what type of drug? Anybody remember? A sedative or depressant drug. And yet we know that if alcohol was only a sedative or depressant, then there might not be quite so an attraction to it. In other words, well, we're going to have a party and we'll get a keg of beer, come on over to the house, we're going to drink and go to sleep. That might not be a real attractive invitation, you know. But again, it's listed as a depressant or a sedative drug. But we know that before alcohol, ethanol is ever a sedative, it is first a stimulant. That's what makes alcohol attractive to anybody that drinks alcohol. And guess what? Over 90% of the people in the United States are going to experiment with alcohol. Over 90% of the people in the United States are going to experiment with alcohol. If we've got a new generation coming, it's going to be over 90%, or at some point in time are going to experiment with alcohol. And we know that over 50% of the people in the United States are going to experiment with an illegal drug, or a legal drug illegally, such as underage drinking or taking somebody else's prescription. You know, those might be legal drugs, but they can be used illegally. So what we see is that 90% of the people are going to experiment with alcohol, over 90%. And over 50% are going to experiment with illegal drugs. But we know that 90% of the people in the United States are not alcoholic. We know that. We know that 90% are not alcoholic. 50% are not addicted to drugs. So what sets people with drug and alcohol problems apart from the others? From people who are social drinkers. Again, when someone drinks ethanol, it is first a stimulant. It's first a stimulant drug to almost everybody that uses it. And again, that's what makes ethanol attractive, is that it stimulates. Let's pretend like we've got 4 teenagers and they're going out for their first drinking experience. And again, this is what happens all across the United States all the time. People have their first drinking experience. And for our experiment, this situation that we're setting up here, we'll say that these 4 teenagers are all having their first drinking experience, and they decide that after a football game on Friday night, they get some beer, and they go out and they're going to drink some. And so they all drink their first beer. And ethanol, being a stimulant, will demonstrate itself as a stimulant because they will start to look like what? What might you start to expect to see happen if these people are experimenting with this stimulant drug? What does a stimulant do to you?
Talking more and laughing.
Might be talking more. You might see people start to laugh a little bit, become a little bit more animated. And all 4 of our teenagers may drink their first beer, and they may experience this. They may drink this first beer, and they start to get stimulated by talking. Their inhibitions go down a little bit. They're able to start, again, maybe their personality changes a little bit. It might not look all that different than any bar or restaurant in any city, anywhere, when people sit down and they have a drink. That's what makes ethanol attractive, is that it is first a stimulant. And they may drink a second beer. Our 4 teenagers may drink a second beer. And when they're drinking that second beer, they're getting even more stimulated. And so, again, it might be more talking, more animation, more laughing. They're having a good time. Teenagers might call what they're doing having anybody? A party. Yeah, it's a party. It becomes, in fact, drinking and drugging is sometimes called partying. Again, it is looked at as a happy, attractive experience in terms of people being able to essentially say, I like this. I like the stimulation that this is doing. But what we also know about ethanol is that not only is it a stimulant, but it's also a poison. It's very toxic to the body. So maybe our teenagers then decide to drink their 3rd beer, and what we see is that 3 of our teenagers start to experience the poisonous effect of this chemical. Now, what might that look like? What's the poisonous effect might look like? Eventually throwing up. Just starting to feel maybe still, the first experience might be just the beginning of that in terms of starting to feel a little nauseated. and we're talking about 3 of our 4. Remember, there's a little trick here. 3 of our 4 teenagers start to have this experience where they may start to feel a little bit nauseated. Then the sedative effect of the chemical might start to be experienced. And this is where the body now starts to slow down. All of a sudden, the stimulant effect is going away, right? And the sedative effect is starting to replace that. So for 3 of our 4 teenagers, it is now kind of quit being fun. It is starting to move and turn into something else. And so 3 of them drink that 3rd beer or part of that 3rd beer, and they're starting to get that little queasy thing in the stomach. They're starting, again, that poisonous effect is starting to set in. You know, the depressant effect, the sedative effect, or the stimulant effect is ending. So if you're experiencing that, if you're starting to feel kind of sick to your stomach, it's not any fun any longer, and somebody says, hey, you want your 4th beer? What might you say? No, thanks. Did you say no thanks because of the way you were raised by your parents? Did you say no thanks because of your economic background? Did you say no thanks because you have more willpower? That you have a stronger character? That you were loved more or less? Or that you had brothers and sisters or didn't? That you grew up in Portsmouth versus New York City versus Los Angeles versus Mexico? No. You said no, why? Because your body was essentially saying, this is not a pleasurable experience any longer. It was starting to reject that. But now let's say that you, because of peer pressure, you didn't want to, everybody else was drinking that 3rd beer. That peer pressure thing, kind of sets in, and you say, okay, I'll try and drink that 3rd beer. Then what might happen? Yeah, we're talking about some pretty severe poisonous and sedative effects that start to happen to the individual. And again, 3 of our 4 teenagers had that experience. Their body essentially started saying, hey, this was really nice, and then it kind of quit being nice. And guess what? That's pretty much the experience they're going to have for the rest of their lives. Social drinkers pretty much know exactly how their body reacts to alcohol, and you'll hear people talk about it. You'll hear them say, I'll have a drink. You want a second? No, thanks, I really don't. Are they doing that because they're stronger people? No, they know their experience. They know their physical experience when they drink alcohol, and it's not because they're better than somebody that has a drug or alcohol problem. It means they're different. And it's not psychological, it's not environmental. What it is they are different in terms of their body. And their body is essentially saying, this quit being fun, so I don't want to do it any longer. And again, it will pretty much stay that way the rest of their lives. Pretty much for the remainder of their lives, they'll have that kind of an experience, especially as we're talking here about ethanol. Now, I said 3 of our 4 teenagers. Now, all of you know somebody that was the 4th teenager, right? Yeah, it might be us. It might be a loved one. We all know somebody that was that 4th teenager. And what happened to the 4th teenager? What was different? Well, what happened with the 4th teenager is that we know that some people physically are able to get a prolonged stimulant effect from alcohol. In other words, this process of moving from stimulation to poison to sedative lingers longer in the stimulant effect than it does with other people. And so this is the person that is able to, they drink their 3rd beer, and the other kids are saying, I don't really want any more, let's go get a pizza, let's go do something else. And this person is essentially saying, no, I'll drink that other beer. Because they are continuing to get stimulated. It is still a pleasurable experience for them. It still feels good to that one teenager. And so they're able to drink more, perhaps, and they're also avoiding these poisonous and sedative effects. Now, we know that the poisonous and sedative effects are for everybody. Everybody gets that. But again, our one teenager gets the stimulant effect longer. It lasts longer. Now, let's say they go out the next Friday night, and the next Friday night, and the same thing keeps happening. 3 of our teenagers drink a couple of beers, and then they want to stop. Our one teenager drinks 3 or 4, they want the party to go on. They're still getting a real positive experience from this. They like it. In fact, one of the words we may hear something like, I love it. We may hear that kind of a description of what that drug felt like to them. Those other 3 teenagers wouldn't be able to describe it that way. You can almost always tell someone who's non-alcoholic versus alcoholic by hearing them describe their first drinking or drug experiences. Ask a non-alcoholic, a social drinker, about the first time they drank. And they'll say something like, well, let's see, it was at my parents' house, they had, I went to this party and there were some people, or maybe it was a time that my cousins came over and they brought something. That's the kind of answer you'll get. Ask an alcoholic their first drinking experience, and they'll say, well, it was September the 14th at 3:30 in the afternoon. I was with this person. I was wearing this. They know everything about that experience. They will remember that. Why? Because it was powerful. It was a powerfully different experience for that person versus the person that got a little bit of stimulation, kind of felt good, it was nice, I might do that again, but you got to be careful because if you drink a little bit too much, here's what happens. You get this other stuff that happens and it's not pleasant. So that's a very different experience, and you'll hear words like, I loved that first experience with alcohol. And the same thing with other drugs. They will try that and have a special, unique experience with that. And so our teenagers are having this different experience. 3 of them, couple, let's go do something else. Our 4th one, wonderful experience, liking it, continuing to be stimulated, able to drink more before the poisonous and sedative effects come in. What's eventually going to happen with our one teenager? How many Friday nights are they going to head out with these other kids drinking if this experience continues? Not very long. What we start to see is that, and again, as a counselor, I've had phone calls from parents and talked to parents who said, my kid didn't have a drinking or drug problem until he started, I know the rest of that sentence? Hanging out with those other kids. That's when the problem starts, when they started hanging out with those other kids. Now, we know that that's not when it started, is it? That's not when it started at all. But what happened is that, in our example, our one teenager had this different experience, this different physical experience. And what do? Birds of a feather flock together. So we start drifting to people who have this same experience. And so we start to find other people who drink or use drugs and get this kind of an experience that they got. And so they will start to change social groups, start to change friends, start to look for people that party and drink like I do, or can get this same kind of an experience. And that will go on for their drinking lifetime. However long they drink or use drugs, that will continue. As their drinking and drug use changes, as it progresses, they may have to find other friends, other groups to be with, other situations and circumstances in which to be in order to drink or use, so that they are with like people in terms of that. Any questions or comments about what we're talking about here so far? Does this prompt any kind of questions? Okay, what we're going to do is, again, try to kind of figure out, what causes this different reaction? Why? What is different about the person who is having this prolonged stimulant effect? And again, we're mainly talking about alcohol right now, but we'll expand that in just a minute. What we know is, what research tells us, and it's pretty clear, that this is a physiological disease. It's a body disease. It's a difference in terms of the body and the brain, especially the parts of the body that we're going to look at here are the liver and the brain are the key areas that are different in terms of this. And again, in talking about the liver functioning, what we know is that when someone consumes ethanol, alcohol, everyone goes through a certain process with that. It is broken down by all human beings pretty much the same way. First, it's broken down into acetaldehyde, and then to acetate, and then it's out of the body. It's actually more complicated than that, but that's what we'll focus on. What we're coming to see is that is the primary area of difference for the alcoholic versus the non-alcoholic. Again, why does the non-alcoholic start to get poisoned more quickly? Why does the sedative effect not last very long? Well, it has to do with how the liver metabolizes ethanol. And this chemical acetaldehyde that is part of the breakdown process seems to be the culprit. Research is pointing to this chemical within the body as being what's different about the alcoholic versus the non-alcoholic from day one. From the very first day that we start to drink, those who are alcoholic, who have this predisposition, are going to metabolize alcohol differently. And what we see is it's almost like the liver is kind of like a highly stoked furnace. It's able to take in ethanol, alcohol, and then be able to metabolize it very rapidly so as to kind of avoid the poisonous and sedative effects or to prolong the stimulant effect. Now again, everyone's eventually going to get poisoned, everybody's going to get sick, everybody's going to experience the hangover, but we know that what we're seeing here is a very powerful stimulant experience from alcohol that not everybody gets. And the liver is the primary area for that. We're also looking at there's also some research that starts to indicate some things too that's very interesting in terms of not only acetaldehyde, but then the byproduct of this chemical breakdown. That when acetaldehyde, again, is created in the body, that it also causes a chemical reaction in the brain. This came to the knowledge of researchers in a study kind of accidentally. There was a group of researchers that were taking a look at brains of alcoholics that had died, trying to look at the kind of damage that alcohol had done over a long period of time. And what they found is that they were removing these brains from kind of skid row alcoholics that had passed away. They were sending them to a laboratory, measuring them, looking at them, what kind of damage had been done and all of that. And then the next thing they say was that, we got a problem. And they went back to the people who were doing the collections and say, what we're finding here is you're sending us heroin addicts. And we're not wanting to study heroin addicts. We're just wanting to study alcoholics. Well, they said, there's no way we're sending you heroin addicts. These folks are coming off skid row. Here's where we're collecting them. They don't have access to heroin. They said, well, there must be something because we're finding an opiate-like substance in their brains. And so what started to be noticed then is that, well, what kind of byproducts might be created when people drink ethanol alcoholically, who are able to consume those kind of quantities of alcohol. And what they found is a chemical that we refer to as tetrahydroisoquinolines. That's the only time I'm going to say it. We're going to talk about TIQs from here on out. But this chemical was found, and again, this is an opiate-like substance that is found in the brain of people who have had chronic alcoholism. And so that led then to kind of the next piece of research that started to link the idea that when somebody that is predisposed to this disease, that one teenager in the four, when they drink alcohol, not only does they have a prolonged stimulant effect, but they're also getting an opiate-like effect from the chemical because of the way that it is metabolized in the body and the way it affects the brain. Now, this means that the high is not the same. That the high is not the same for somebody who has this different body. That when again, 90% of the people experiment with alcohol, and then this unique experience is had by only a certain percentage of people. And again, what we know is that everyone has a pleasure center in their brain. And this pleasure center determines a lot of things. It determines a lot of things about a person's life. It determines what you like to do as far as hobbies. It determines what you like to do in terms of relationships. It is essentially that place where decisions are made, preferences are determined in terms of what you enjoy in life. And everybody has that. Everybody has a pleasure center. And we know that drugs and alcohol very actively, very powerfully affect this pleasure center. But what we see is that for those who have this predisposition to alcoholism, that this chemical reaction makes a very powerful experience within the pleasure center. And that anytime anybody experiences something that very powerful, what we see is that there's going to be an attraction to that. Again, a very powerful attraction to that. Anybody ever watch the morning TV shows when they talk about like the Today Show and Good Morning America and all of that? Very popular shows. I see them about every day. And one of the things I notice on those shows almost every time is that they have commercials for drugs. And they'll say, do you have these symptoms? And usually when they get down about the third or fourth symptom, I'm pretty certain I've got this disease that they're advertising here on television. And I say, oh yeah, my nose runs when I go outside, and this happens and that happens. And then they're going to give you the drug, and here's how this drug works. It's going to take away these terrible symptoms that you have. But what happens at the very end of the commercial?
Nasty side effects.
Yeah, there's something called side effects to the chemical. In other words, if you take this drug, it's going to clear up your nose. You also, your eyes might fall out, or, that you can't, you're not going to be able to sleep. There's all kinds of other side effects that happen. But they don't happen to everybody, do they? Those side effects don't happen to everybody. They happen to some people. And that's what they'll say, is that, the majority of people who take this drug, here's what it does for them. It clears up their sinuses, or it helps them do this, or it takes away these symptoms, these bad physical symptoms. But for some people, they will also have these bad side effects, and so you've got to be watching for that. Well, alcohol, marijuana, crack cocaine, heroin, Oxycontin, these drugs all have side effects, meaning they don't react on people the same way. When one person takes it, it may do this. Most people say, I drink, I don't understand. Alcoholics hear this all the time. Why do you drink the way you do? And what the person is essentially saying when they say, why do you drink the way they do? They're saying, you drink differently than me. I go out for dinner and have a cocktail, or I have wine with dinner and I drink that, and that's all I want. Yes. Because that person's physically different. They do not experience what the alcoholic experiences when they take in that chemical, or the drug addict when they take that chemical. We know that a lot of people who take narcotics, such as painkillers, they go to the hospital and they take that and they say, I hated that experience. It made me feel terrible. They gave me this drug and I felt awful after I took it. How do people abuse that? I don't understand how people can abuse that drug. Well, because they don't have the same physical reaction to it that you did. That's the answer to that question. It's not that you've got a stronger character or you're better put together psychologically or emotionally. It's none of those things at all. What is different is that your body reacted different to that. And again, this experience of this different high, acetaldehyde, TIQs, hitting the pleasure center, opiate-like experience, what that produces is here's a technical word I'm going to use that we're going to use kind of over and over through the loved one sessions to be able to kind of understand what that really is about. And here's the technical word for this. Wow. It's the wow experience. And again, not everybody gets the wow experience. Most people cannot understand what is so attractive about alcohol or other drugs. They just don't see the big deal. I smoked a joint one time, so what? It didn't do a thing. I didn't like it. It made me sleepy, made me hungry. I drink a little bit of alcohol, but I cannot understand why somebody would drink 3 or 4, or 5, or get drunk. I just don't understand that. If I drink more than a couple, I get sick. It feels lousy. People talk about narcotics and say, I had to take that painkiller and my gosh, it made me sick to my stomach or gave me a headache. I don't get it. I don't understand why people do that. And loved ones are always asking that question. Why? Why in the world does the person I care so much about, why are they so attracted to drugs and alcohol? Why are they so attracted to getting drunk and getting high? They can't understand it primarily because they can't understand this different physical reaction that the person with addiction has that they don't. They don't. Why do you drink the way you do? The alcoholic doesn't have an answer to that either. The alcoholic or the addict doesn't know why either. Most alcoholics and addicts don't get this information, before they start drinking or using. And so when that question gets asked, we kind of answer it the same way. We must just be weak. You must have more willpower than I. Maybe I got other my problems in my life. Maybe the way I was, we start going through that whole litany of reasons why we may have a drug or alcohol problem and somebody else doesn't. Not understanding that essentially our body made that decision. So this wow experience becomes the driving force. That initial experience with the chemical kind of sets the stage. And the person doesn't know they have it. A person doesn't have this wow experience and then say, gosh, now I know what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be an alcoholic. I want to be a drug addict. It's not that way at all. The person that has that wow experience doesn't know that what just happened to them was all that different than what happens to other people. They don't know it either. Your loved ones didn't know it. So it's nobody's fault. Family members are always struggling with, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? Maybe I should have done this, or I should have done that. Maybe I did too much of this and not enough of that in terms of being able to be a good parent or to be a good spouse. What was it that was lacking in me as a family member that caused this person to turn to drugs and alcohol? The alcoholic's asking the same question. What's the matter with me? Why in the world, am I doing this to myself and to other people? And again, it's nobody's fault. It's not even the alcoholic's fault. They did not set out for this to happen. They had a different physiological reaction to this chemical, which set the stage for the rest of it to happen. Let's stop there and see if we have any questions or comments before I move on. Any questions or comments about what we're talking about so far? Yeah.
So the pleasure center, is that the same thing as your serotonin?
The question being is the pleasure center, is that like the source of serotonin and these other brain chemicals? Kind of the same thing. It is. It's all kind of related. And what we know is that there are certain brain chemicals that have to do with mood and pleasure and what feels good and what doesn't feel good. And we know that for some people, again, and not the majority of people, but for some people, drugs really manipulate that brain chemistry differently than it does in other folks. It's not the same. And again, it becomes a very powerful experience. So yeah, the pleasure center is very much a part of those brain chemicals that we know as serotonin or endorphins, and this whole mixture of kind of cascading brain chemical reactions that happen when we take in alcohol. But again, people in general learn how to manipulate that brain chemistry. For some people, it might be jumping out of an airplane and coming down on a parachute. For other people, it might be sewing. For other people, it might be being a parent. There's all kinds of things that bring us pleasure. For most people, drugs and alcohol don't bring that kind of pleasure. But for some of us, it does. Other questions or comments?
Does addiction to drugs work the same way as addiction to alcohol?
Does addiction to drugs work the same way as it does with alcohol? It's a little differently. I mentioned there are different pathways to addiction. Alcohol is actually a very toxic chemical. Ethanol is very toxic. So what we see is that there are just a very kind of small percentage of our population that can become addicted to alcohol because it is so poisonous. Other drugs are not as poisonous. We start to move up into other drugs, we see that other drugs are much more highly addictive. So alcohol, we might say, has an addiction rate of something like maybe 10%. There are other drugs that the addiction rate is much higher. Anybody know what the two most addictive drugs that we know of in our society? Nicotine and caffeine. About 85+% of the people who experiment with those chemicals become addicted to it. And again, we see that all the time. We see people, we see a lot of people that, they're addicted to caffeine, they're addicted to nicotine, and because those chemicals are the pathway to addiction for them can be very, very rapid, and the majority of people seem to be able to fall victim to that addiction. And then we start working our way down. Then we might start to see, drugs like crack cocaine, methamphetamine, narcotics, start kind of coming down the list. Not as addictive as those drugs. You might see, where people, maybe 60% of the people who have experimented or taken a narcotic, will develop a problem with that. But a lot of people won't. Again, you will hear some people say, I took that one pain pill and went right to sleep, and it was not a pleasant experience. You hear another person be able to say, I took 5 of them and went to a party. It's a different physical experience that people have, with a narcotic drug. Some people might try crack cocaine and say that was terrible. I had an immediate headache. It was awful. Another person says it was the greatest thing that ever happened in my life. As far as a powerful feeling. So again, people experience things differently. But we know that drugs are differently addictive in terms of how addictive they are. And again, alcohol being one of the lesser addictive drugs. And caffeine, nicotine kind of at the top of the list. And then everything else kind of falling in between. In terms of how other drugs impact addiction, how they cause addiction, again, it's still pretty similar in terms of how the disease is going to progress and the fact that the person gets this wow experience with that chemical. And you may see people that drink alcohol and say, I really never did care much for alcohol. But at some point in time, they tried a different drug, they experimented, and wow, they got that. It happened. That particular chemical, matched up with, again, their brain chemistry, the way their body metabolizes the chemical, and they got this. They got this wow experience. But the reality is the majority of people don't get this wow experience no matter what drug they take. They just don't really get that. And that's the reason they don't get people, don't understand people who do, because it's two very different physiological reactions to the chemical. Yes?
Is there a blood test that you can take to see how you metabolize?
Is there a blood test in terms of being able to see how you metabolize alcohol, kind of a precursor to be able to identify whether there's, a person might be alcoholic? Not at this point necessarily, but again, they're doing a lot of work in terms of trying to identify the chromosome that essentially sets people apart. Now, I don't know what we'll do with that information once we have it. I mean, if you tell somebody, that's 13 years old, you have a real strong predisposition to having this to having alcoholism or other drug addiction, will that person then choose not to experiment? Or would they say, well, that won't happen to me? So we don't really know what benefit we'll have if we are able to somehow predict who is or who isn't, predisposed to addiction beforehand. Other questions or comments about what we're talking about so far? Okay, you've probably heard it said that addiction is hereditary. Alcoholism is hereditary. It's, it passes from generation to generation, and it seems to be more prevalent in certain ethnic groups and certain families. And that is true, because again, what we see is that how a person's body metabolizes this chemical, how it reacts to this drug that is coming into it, is a hereditary quality. Liver function, brain chemistry can be a hereditary quality. Now, does that mean that if somebody has an alcoholic, if somebody's alcoholic, that all their children are going to be alcoholic? No, because it's just like any other hereditary quality. Just like hair color. Not all my children are going to be blonde. Not all my children are going to have brown hair. Some may have blonde, some may have brown. There may be an odd color that may show up, because that happens, sometimes. What we know is that it's an hereditary quality just like any other. That it does show up more heavily in some families, and certainly more heavily in certain ethnic groups than it does in others. And so for that reason, it can kind of be looked at, and family history becomes important. Now, one of the things that kind of is mystifying to family members sometimes is that maybe somebody grew up in an alcoholic home and said, I'm never going to drink alcohol. I'm just not going to drink. I saw bad things happen as a result, and so I'm going to raise my kids without there being any alcohol around, and that way they won't be at risk either. And then their child grows up and they're 16, 17, 18 years old. They go out and they experiment with alcohol, just like 90% of the people do, and bam, it's a wow experience, and they're off and running and they're having problems. And this person who never drank is saying, what happened? What did I do wrong? They did absolutely nothing wrong. The family member did nothing wrong. All that happened is that they chose not to drink, and so they never knew this experience. They may have had it too, but they didn't. But again, the genetic predisposition to this disease was passed right down on, to the next person. And when they did experiment, then they had this powerful experience, that will again start to progress itself into what would be identified as addiction.